Hello to all of our listeners. Today we have a discussion for you with Aaron David Miller. Aaron David Miller is a long-serving U.S. diplomat, former U.S. diplomat, who served at the U.S. Department of State for 24 years, focusing mostly on Middle East issues. Aaron is considered a leading American expert on the Middle East peace process. He is also now at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which was ranked as the #1 think tank in the world by the University of Pennsylvania, where he's a senior fellow. He's also widely published commentator in many leading international news outlets on this issue. And we're here with Aaron as Israel and Palestine have regained their position at the top of the news cycle, with a new Israeli government coming into power that has raised a lot of controversies, both domestically and internationally.
John, you left out maybe the most important thing. Aaron is maybe our first major guest on this program that we've set up 3 years ago. So he's seen it evolve from the infant days on Clubhouse to what we're doing now. Aaron, thank you very much for spending some of your Sunday afternoon with us. How are you doing today?
We're great, and grandkids are in town, but everything's great. And John and Justin, it's great to be here with you.
So Aaron, I want to start out with a question that we have every year. How likely is a potential violent conflict in the West Bank this year in your estimation?
Well, some would argue that we're already there. I think if you ask Pythia, the Oracle of Delphi, reading the best of Godin trails, she could no more tell you if and when there'll be a massive sustained confrontation. And those are the terms I would use to define what differentiates the usual period from let's say, the first and second intifadas, which both had unique characteristics of their own. I think it's almost impossible to make this sort of prediction. What you can say, I believe, is that we are entering what I would consider to be a unique period. And we're entering a unique period because the winds are being driven by I would argue, a perfect storm. Number one, you have a 56, soon to be 57-year-old Israeli occupation against which most everything else needs to be framed, in which the occupier and the occupied go through a very perverse and perilous dance with one another, now for entering well into its sixth decade. Second, you have a weakening of the Palestinian Authority beyond a point where I think we've seen it since the early 90s when it was first established. Mahmoud Abbas is now in the 18th year of a 4-year term. He's 87 years old. He's lost tremendous credibility, in large part because he couldn't produce the sort of economic gains, but more important, he can't make any progress toward ending the Israeli occupation and the creation of a Palestinian state. He's been accused of corruption, nepotism, and his decision a year plus ago to cancel elections, which haven't been held since 2006, cost him greatly, particularly among young Palestinians, and boosted Hamas's stock in Gaza. Third, you've got, in areas like Nablus and Jenin, which were always difficult to control, the emergence of young Palestinians, some affiliated with Hamas and Palestine Islamic Jihad, some affiliated with Fatah's Tanzim, some independents, who are resisting the occupation and planning terror attacks. And four, you've got the emergence, December 29th of 2022, of the most right-wing and fundamentalist government in Israel's history. Now, I would argue, expert or no expert, that the combustible potential of these four elements, all tied together, would inevitably, invariably lead to some sort of explosion. Now, 2022 was the deadliest year for Palestinians since 2005, and most of that occurred not under this current government, but under the so-called government of change, first with Prime Minister Bennett, then with Prime Minister Lapid. And now you have 40, I don't know if you believe the Palestinian Ministries of Health's figure, you have 40 Palestinians killed already in 2023, and 9, 10, 11 Israelis. So I think we're in something that could be already differentiated from an earlier period. You've got a proliferation of weapons, both manufactured and on the black market. You've got an Israeli government that has basically committed itself according to the guidelines. Forget the specific positions of the two most extreme parties. One actually now merged out of two parties to exclusive and completely authorized possession, Israeli claim to all of the lands of Israel, the most important being what the settlers called Judea and Samaria and Jerusalem. So I think we're in a confrontation already of sorts. And I think as we enter the very fraught period of Ramadan and Passover, March, April, the propensity for something much worse than we've seen is, I think, very real. Violence and terror has always been a handmaiden, a companion of this process from its inception, long predating even the establishment of the State of Israel. And that's in large part because Israelis and Palestinians, unlike Israelis and Syrians, Israelis and Jordanians, Israelis and Egyptians, certainly Israelis and any of the Gulf states, proximity drives this conflict. Whether it was Mark Twain or Ben Franklin who said proximity breeds contempt and children, the reality is Israelis and Palestinians, their past, their presence, and their futures are inextricably linked together. And that proximity guarantees, virtually guarantees, that there will be no status quo. The real question, the only question, and it's been dogging me now ever since leaving government, is whether the future belongs to what I would call the forces of history on one hand, or whether the future belongs to the forces of diplomacy, accommodation, and some sort of rational compromise on the other. Right now, I think you'd lose money, frankly, if you bet against the forces of history, but that could change. And again, I caution everyone. I occupy a very small space for a very short period of time on this planet. I can't see around corners. I've got kids who are now in their 40s. I would never say never. Just one additional point. You need four things to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We've never had them all aligned together. They've aligned with Israel and Jordan. They've aligned with Israel and Egypt, but never on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Number one, you need leaders who are masters of their political houses, not prisoners of their ideologies. Number two, you need a sense of ownership. That is to say, Israelis and Palestinians need to care more about making these decisions than any external mediator and whatever pressure those mediators or external forces want to apply. You know the old saying, Justin, I've used it, I'm sure, in Clubhouse, that in the history of the world, nobody ever washed a rental car. And the reason for that is people care only about what they own. Second, leadership is missing, ownership is missing, effective U.S. mediation is missing. Not since George H.W. Bush and James Baker, for whom I worked, have we seen that. And finally, you really do need some sort of end state, end game that offers a pathway so that both the legitimate requirements of each side can be addressed. And frankly, right now, none of these factors are in place. I would settle for the first two. And I would only point out that every breakthrough, Israel, Jordan, Israel, Egypt, and Israel Palestinians, were all done without, I'll stress this 5 times, without the participation of the United States. Only when there was a measure of traction and some sense of confidence that Israelis and Palestinians might be able to get what they wanted did the United States come in at various times to play, on balance, I would say, a very positive role. But Joe Biden has many other things to do. It's a busy world. This doesn't offer much promise for success. Presidents don't like fighting with Israel for obvious reasons. So we'll have to wait and see on this one.
Aaron, you talked about the importance of having an end game in mind, that in order to have a progressive solution, you would want all the key players to be focused on a similar end, hopefully the two-state solution, as the U.S. have always supported. But I think that right now there's concern that the Israelis have a different end game in mind. And in fact, the current coalition are focused on making the full annexation of the West Bank a reality. And I wanted to hear your perspective about that. Do you believe that the annexation of the West Bank is something that the current Israeli government has in mind? And do you think it's inevitable?
I think the current Israeli government, particularly the religious Zionist parties, a combination of two, led by Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, want to bind 60% of the West Bank, that is Area C, according to the Oslo Accords, where you have most of the Israeli settlers and roughly 200,000 to 300,000 Palestinians, want to bind that area permanently to Israel. Whether you call it de jure, de facto creeping annexation. Some argue that the deed is already done. It's too late. It's 5 minutes. Meron Ben-Venisti in the 80s used to say it was 5 minutes to midnight in the 80s. And if people didn't move on this issue, there would be nothing left to negotiate. So I do think that that's exactly what more extreme fundamentalist elements in the current coalition want, to bind at least 60% of the West Bank to Israel proper, and to make any solution other than Jerusalem as the indivisible internal capital of Israel the dominant reality. Those, I think, are the two priorities. Can they accomplish that? The answer is if in fact this government gets a 4-year term and there are no countervailing pressures and forces to block it, then you might be able to say, even I might have to admit, that through no fault of its own, perhaps, the Biden administration will be the last American administration and will preside over the end of what I would argue to you both is the least bad solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is separation through negotiations into two states with fundamental resolution of the issue of borders, security, Jerusalem, refugees, and, most importantly, the abandonment of all juridical or irredentist claims to produce an end of conflict solution. That right now seems light years away. And I would say to both of you, I'm going to be 74. I could say it is almost beyond my imagination that I will be here to see an Israeli prime minister stand before the Knesset and a Palestinian prime minister before the Palestine Legislative Council and say the following: on the core issues that divide us, borders, security, refugees, Jerusalem, and the end of conflict, we're done. It may take time because of our past of traumatizing one another, historical wounding, to move forward toward peaceful, normal relations, but we're done. Conflict is over. I find it almost impossible to imagine hearing that.
You mentioned before the clashes in 2022, last year, and that was mostly focused around Gaza. And the tension that we're seeing today and the focus today is much more concentrated on the West Bank. And I'm wondering how much different this will look, how much that changes the dynamic and the new phase of conflict that we're anticipating.
Hamas's position on this is an intriguing one. And let's be clear about something else. We talk a lot about Israeli settlement policies, land confiscation, housing demolitions, and now the possibility Knesset just passed legislation which will authorize the deportation of Palestinians and stripping Palestinians of residency, Israeli Arabs of residency and citizenship, and deporting them to the West Bank if they are accused of terrorist attacks. We talk a lot about that. We don't talk about the problem of the Palestinians losing their monopoly over the forces of violence within their society. And that's an important aspect. I raise it only because to talk about the possibility of a confrontation without engaging Hamas or including Hamas is not reasonable. Hamas's calculation, I think, for the moment, is that they do not want to spark or trigger or provide any pretext for the Israelis to mount major air and artillery strikes. No one is contemplating the prospects of a major ground invasion on the part of the Israelis into Gaza. And Netanyahu has proven himself to be one of the most risk-averse Israeli prime ministers when it comes to the use of force. Hamas would rather, in large part because they are benefiting both from Gulf money, the relaxation of some imports of materials into Gaza right now. They don't want to involve themselves in the conflict. What they'd like to do is to orchestrate conflict, both from the West Bank and based on what they saw happen in May 2021, when you had the worst violence between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews since the pre-state period in mixed cities and towns like Ramla and Lod. They'd like to orchestrate an uprising that essentially is focused on the West Bank and within Israel proper and Jerusalem. However, if you do get a conflict, one of the trigger points, flashpoints, is going to be Jerusalem. And if in fact that happens, it's very unlikely that Hamas will stay out of this. So you'll see high trajectory weapons launched from Gaza. And at that point, the conflict morphs into something else entirely. It morphs into a sort of confrontation between two armed elements. One, the Israelis with overwhelming military power and economic power. But nonetheless, if you look at May 2021, what happened is that the sympathy, certainly of the United States, was with Palestinians before this morphed into a confrontation of high trajectory weapons. And once that happens, then I think any chance of using that conflict or confrontation to create a pathway to de-escalate toward actually preventing further conflict, it diminishes, in large part because of the perception of Hamas and Hamas's own goals. So I think chances are, it seems very unlikely that you could have a second intifada-like uprising, because it would require the active acquiescence or participation of the Palestinian Authority and Fatah. And that would mean some cooperation, collaboration with Hamas, which essentially is going to mean that Gaza would remain a target and a launching point for Hamas weapons. So I've often thought, since violence preceded almost every other breakthrough, certainly preceded the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty and the 1973 war, right? The first intifada produced Oslo. Isn't it possible that some conflict, some confrontation that was qualitatively and quantitatively worse than anything we've seen would even cause the parties to look in the mirror and say to themselves, we need to figure out a way to de-escalate? We've had a lot of pain in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but unfortunately, most of that pain is never accompanied by gain. And I don't see very many ways in which a horrible conflict, I mean, look at the second intifada, 3,000 Palestinians killed, over 1,000 Israelis killed. And we've been in this 20-year plus lull ever since the Camp David summit, where you've had you've had serious, credible efforts, but nothing that would even come close to an agreement.
And now, as president, I'm proud to say that our relationship with the State of Israel is deeper and stronger, in my view, than it's ever been. And with this visit, we're strengthening our connections even further. We have reaffirmed the unshakable commitment of the United States to Israel's security, including partnering with Israel on the most cutting-edge defense systems in the world. I will once more return to the hollow ground of Yad Vashem to honor 6 million Jewish lives were stolen in a genocide, and continue, which we must do every day, continue to bear witness.
Why is the United States such a staunch ally with Israel? And I ask this with the backdrop of understanding Netanyahu is in power. He has shown previously to be willing to meddle in United States politics directly. We have the history of Iran-U.S. nuclear negotiations, where there have been reports of Israel undermining our efforts to create a long-standing and somewhat more sustainable situation with Iran in their pursuit of nuclear power. We also have the longstanding situation of the Palestinians, and it looks like the two-state solution is not in an optimistic state right now. Israel is very close with China economically. And lastly, we've seen this in the most recent conflict in Ukraine, and more specifically, the Netanyahu government. They are beginning to, it appears publicly at least, pivot to a more pro-Russia stance.
The reasons have been manifest now for almost Israel's celebrating its 75th anniversary. You got the moral debt that the Americans believe and the Western world believes it owes to the Jewish people in the wake of the Nazi genocide, number one. You've got a very affluent and well-organized Jewish community, now supported at times by millions of evangelicals who, for reasons of eschatology and end of days, see the redemption of Israel as figuring prominently in their own religious belief system. You have the fact that Israel is an ally of the United States. We pre-positioned material there. We exercise with the Israelis. Juniper Oak recently, last month, was the largest exercise ever in the history of the U.S.-Israeli military relationship, directed, although the administration doesn't admit it, toward the likely scenarios in the event of an Iranian-Israeli or Iranian-American military confrontation. And you have the issue of value affinity. However imperfect Israel's democracy, and let's be clear, it's very imperfect. You could argue, some would argue, Israel is a preferential democracy. It's not a democracy for all of its citizens. You have 2 million Israeli Arabs, Palestinian citizens of Israel, who, according to the Israeli Declaration of Independence, should be treated as equal citizens. But we know they suffer systemic social and economic discrimination. Nonetheless, it's the only arguable democracy in the region. And value affinity, which is why the emergence of this Israeli government is so telling, value affinity, which many Israelis over the years that I've talked to seem to sort of trivialize. No, you support us because we are a military power. You support us because we are a beachhead for American interests in the region. But the problem with that is, and yes, we exercise with the Israeli, yes, we share intel, yes, we pre-position material. But if you look at the various crisis points, I remember 1991 during the first Gulf War, we did unbelievable diplomacy to try to keep the Israelis out of responding to Saddam Hussein's drone strikes, because we understood, and I think we finally brought the Israelis to understand, that this was a war not between Saddam and Israel, which would have played right into his hands, but a war between Saddam and the world, right, the international community. So I don't want to downplay. I just want to set in perspective the real glue that creates the basis for this relationship, in my judgment, is the value affinity. And if that value affinity fractures, the U.S. and Israel are basically cooperating only on the basis of material interests. We had relationships with Panama, with the Philippines, a dozen other countries. You don't want a relationship with the United States based totally on interest. You want a relationship based on interest, yes, but also on common and shared values. Because if you ask me what was one of the, other than protecting the security of the United States, which is the organizing principle of any nation's foreign policy, ours in this case, I would say the other objective of American foreign policy is support for like-minded societies. That's the broadest conception of our national interest, other than protecting the homeland, is the broadest, supporting like-minded societies. Israel is one of them. However imperfect their own democracy, however controversial their approach is toward Palestinians, wrong-headed in many respects, with respect to the occupation. And if that withers or fractures, then I think the nature of the U.S.-Israeli relationship will change. I just want one additional point. Right now, for reasons both of politics and policy, I think the Biden administration is very wary of being drawn into a sustained public confrontation with Benjamin Netanyahu. It's bad politics, particularly when you have a Republican Party that has emerged as the Israel right or wrong party, the go-to party, and a Democratic Party which is divided. Increasing number of progressives who want to hold Israel accountable. Many traditional supporters of Israel in the Democratic Party, which are very worried. You've heard their voices in the wake of the emergence of this government. I think Biden does not want to get into this, particularly in the next several weeks. He may announce his decision to seek a second term. And on the policy side, my experience is the president's fight with the Israelis usually under only one set of circumstances, when in fact they believe that the fight can be made worthwhile. All right. So think Jerry Ford and Henry Kissinger fighting with the Israelis in the Second Disengagement Agreement in 1975. Think Jimmy Carter fighting with the Israelis over Camp David. Think Bush 41 and James Baker fighting with the Israelis over Madrid. They could justify the fight with an ally, with a close ally. if in fact they could achieve something. I think right now the Biden administration looks at the Palestinian issue and they know it's headed for some kind of explosion. They're trying to head it off. The piece of breaking news that we now know is that there's some sort of deal in the works in which the UAE, which had brought to Security Council a resolution very critical of Israeli settlement activity, has now stood down in exchange for any number of things we've heard that the Israelis are prepared to do. Reduce the numbers of military strikes into the West Bank, create more economic assistance for the Palestinians. The Americans have offered as part of this package, reportedly, to move to request that the consulate reopen, Jerusalem consulate reopen, and also agreed sometime this year for a visit to the White House by Mahmoud Abbas. And the Palestinians have agreed to resume security cooperation with the Israelis. Now, whether or not this deal holds, whether or not it's actually a deal, unclear. But it suggests to me that, number one, the administration understands they can't simply express strong views, that they have to start doing things in order to head off what could be a situation that will draw them in, as happened in May 2021 during the Israeli-Hamas confrontation. So Biden's walking a fine line, but let's be clear, his foreign policy, first of all, whether or not Biden's legacy in terms of supporting Ukraine against Russia helps him politically in 2024 is highly arguable. Look at George H.W. Bush in Iraq. I mean, brilliant coordination of military and political strategy, pushes Saddam out of Kuwait within weeks or months, very low American casualty rate, doesn't go to Baghdad. Post-war diplomacy, Madrid Peace Conference, boom, Bush is a one-term president. So, but if any issue defines Biden's foreign policy legacy, it's not going to be the Middle East. It's going to be his efforts to deal with Russia and China.
You just dug into value affinity, and we've had almost unanimously, politicians across the political spectrum support Ukraine and are giving arms, are giving intelligence, and creating a global coalition, or at least spearheading a global coalition to support them in their fight against Russia because of values, democratic society, preventing authoritarian creep, imperialism, so on and so forth. You've had Mitch McConnell forcefully out there at the Munich Security Conference saying he's going to basically drag his party to the table to continue supporting Ukraine because our values are enmeshed and aligned. And this is the biggest defining issue that we face in international relations currently. Can you get into how Israel is approaching Russia, and more specifically, if Israel is kind of playing this middle road, could this act as another form of eroding the value affinity that you just explained between the United States and Israel?
You know, I think there are three issues that are working to put these shared values under stress. One is obviously the judicial reform that actually that's a euphemism for eviscerating the power and influence of the Israeli Supreme Court. The Palestinian issue is number two, and Ukraine is number three. But Ukraine is distinctly number three. Because as we know, the Israelis are not the only power government that are hedging. Of the 10 most populated countries in the world, only one is fully on board with sanctions, and that's us. 2/3 of the world live in countries that are not fully subscribed to sanctioning Russia, including India, Brazil. Lula was just here, and I'm sure they agreed to disagree on the issue of Brazilian support for Putin. Fertilizers, critically important for Brazil. Yet, Israel is not Brazil, and Israel is not India. It is America's closest ally in the region. It is the only democracy in the region. It is one of the few countries in the region, the Kurds and Armenians, I suppose, if you broaden the regional reach, are also peoples and nations that have been victimized by genocide. So for those three reasons, one would expect that the Israelis would have been much more forthcoming with respect to his military assistance to Ukraine. The Israelis argue We have other equities to protect. You have to understand. You don't have Russia in your backyard. We do, in Syria, basically. We can't afford to alienate Putin. There are Russian Jews in Russia. The Russians provide us with a good deal of margin and flexibility in terms of our campaign between the wars. We carried out hundreds of military strikes over the last several years in Syria, with always deconflicting with the Russians, erstwhile supporters of the Assad regime. That comes from our ability to maintain relations with Putin. Netanyahu, before the new government was formed, but after he was elected, said he would review this issue. But I'm not sure you're going to get a fundamental change. The Israelis are not going to supply military equipment to the Russians. You know that we asked them, Biden administration asked them to supply old Hawk missiles. They demurred. I don't know if they finally said no. They're not going to. Patriots are too scarce. Iron Dome, they're not prepared to let go. Will that change? I think it would change under only one circumstance. And I don't think it's going to change. And that is if Putin, desperate to protect Crimea and avoid a collapse of the Russian military, decided to deploy chemical weapons or a tactical nuclear weapon. The Israelis would have no choice. But in a way, by then it's too late. I think there's a lot of disappointment in the fact that the Israelis have not been more forthcoming. But again, nations have their interests. They follow them. We should keep our expectations with many of these countries very low, including, I might add, the Saudis and the Emiratis, who for various reasons, have a reason to actively establish close cooperation with Putin.
Thousands of demonstrators have rallied outside Israel's parliament against planned judicial reforms. Opponents claim the proposed changes attack democracy. The measures would give the government more power to appoint Supreme Court judges. Ministers say the reforms would correct an imbalance of power between lawmakers and the court.
Democracy is one of the main slogans at this protest. Tens of thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets. They fear that democracy is under threat.
I'm here to demonstrate against changing laws which will make this country, which we love, not a democracy anymore. That's it.
More people are coming to demonstrations, and we have to stay optimistic. If we don't have our hope, there's nothing left. And we're doing what we can, and we think that maybe today it's a very historic day. And we hope that they'll hear us, and they'll hear us screaming, and that's all we can do.
We came here to protest against this very quick, very aggressive change of law, and there's a lot of people that just are very unhappy with what the parts of the government are trying to do here.
They are here to send a message to Benjamin Netanyahu's new far-right government, which wants to overhaul the justice system and reduce the influence of the nation's Supreme Court.
Aaron, it's funny that you mentioned the Emiratis and the Saudis, because it reminded me of something that you were saying earlier, which is that if the United States and Israel drift apart on the values issues, then all they're left with is a relationship that's based on material exchange and security interests. And that is more or less what our relationships with some of our key partners in the region look like today: Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, among others. You mentioned that the relationship with Israel could be justified as a security beachhead, but in fact, those other countries probably offer us more in that regard. Certainly, Qatar and Kuwait have been very useful places for U.S. military bases as we've focused on threats from Iran and also our involvement in Iraq. But it seems to me that if we were going to see an evolution of the Israeli relationship that moves more to a security footing rather than one based on shared values of democracy, maybe the model in the region or near the region would indeed be Turkey. In fact, Netanyahu does in some ways remind observers of Erdogan, the leader of Turkey, and how he's moved the country in a direction of anti-democratic drift. And I think that this really brings us to the other big news topic of the day, which is the judicial reforms that you already mentioned, Aaron, but which we're very keen to hear more of your perspective about. And it makes us wonder if Israel is in fact headed towards more of a hybrid regime status than a true democracy status, like we've been seeing in Turkey.
Yeah, Erdogan has behaved in a way that has not just reflected in a liberal slide, but it's a determined effort to consolidate and centralize power. I don't think the Israelis are there yet. Frankly, in my own view, I think given the nature of these protests and demonstrations and the resistance from the high-tech community, from the Standard & Poor's analyst follows Israel, basically said that these reforms could jeopardize their confidence in Israel's credit ratings in the future, should it actually occur. I don't think that's where Israel's headed. I think the demonstrations now in their 7th week shows that it's going to be very difficult for the Israeli government to push this judicial revolution forward. But Israel has been moving rightward in the last several decades, particularly among young Israelis who know nothing of Prime Ministers Rabin and or Peres or anything of a peace process. If you were born in the year 2000 and you're 23 years old, I mean, all you've seen, mostly you've seen Benjamin Netanyahu and other tough-minded Israeli prime ministers. I think the Israelis will course correct, but I think the course correction, if it occurs, and remember, the average length of Israeli government since independence is 1.8 years. I wouldn't bet either of my mortgages on the fact that this government is going to collapse soon, but I think it's highly unlikely this government will survive a full 4-year term. And I think I mentioned there will be a course correction, but I think if you do have a course correction, you're not going back. I think people understand this. You're not going back because to a place where Israel has never been, which is a left of center government empowered to make far-reaching, magnanimous changes with respect to the Palestinian issue. Peacemaking in Israel has been the purview of hard men, deeply conservative, from Begin to Rabin to Sharon's disengagement from Gaza, even to Netanyahu's dalliance with the PLO during the 90s when we worked on a couple interim agreements, which Netanyahu concluded with Arafat, something he vowed he'd never do. Israel isn't going back to some mythical, fantastical left-of-center environment. It's going to go back to a center-right, rational country that has a great respect for free markets and for democratic process. I would describe it as the old Likud, not the fundamentalist Likud. And that is going to leave Israeli democracy in a better position. I mean, Netanyahu himself has been a champion of the independence of the Supreme Court for years. He now is in the position he has, 5 elections, and now one successful, because his trial now 3 years in for fraud, bribery, and breach of trust at some point is going to conclude, and he could very well be indicted or to take a plea deal to leave politics. He needs that judicial reform in order to pass legislation or appoint a new attorney general or get judges more to his liking. So I think you will have this course corrective, but the old Likud, as I describe it, will still be confronting West Bankers, Gazans, and East Jerusalemites and Palestinian citizens of Israel with a very conservative view about how much it should give. The protests, I spent a minute talking about the protests. They are unprecedented, both in terms of their size. Now in the 7th week, last Monday, 100,000 Israelis estimated gathered in Jerusalem during the middle of the day, which meant 2 things. They left work and they're not getting reimbursed. The kids left school. The Israelis have never seen anything quite like this before. There have been protests and demonstrations dating back as early as 1952 when there were violent demonstrations against the Israeli government's determination to reach an agreement with Germany over reparations. You had hundreds of thousands of Israelis out in the streets in 1982 protesting Israel's policy in Lebanon. You had social and economic protests in 2011, but nothing like this. And the composition of the protesters, middle-class Israelis, right-wing Israelis who are constituents of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, former military and security officials, army reservists. And I think that the issue for them is not just judicial reform, it's nothing short of a struggle to maintain what they believe is their identity. It's like, I'd compare it to maybe to some degree like Brexit became that kind of issue over identity with that kind of emotion. And it's not going to stop. So it'll be interesting to see exactly how Netanyahu, who's never experienced anything like this before, he's already had one visit to the UAE canceled or postponed because of the nature of the government. And I suspect his invitation to Washington may be on hold as well. Although this breaking news on the so-called deal may well facilitate an earlier visit to Washington. I think that there's enough pushback against Israelis from all different walks of life to challenge the judicial reform. Whether it's going to happen or not, I don't know. But it's hard to rile up half of the country without having some cost or consequence.
Aaron, you were saying that there's hopefully going to be some type of reform back to the old Likud, and the way you were describing it, I think a lot of our listeners and a lot of Americans would be able to attribute that to our current Republican Party. And we don't need some fantastical center-left amalgamation to come out of the GOP. We just need to get rid of the authoritarian creep, the religious fanaticism, and other aspects of that party. So I thought, being a domestic political guy here in the U.S., that was a rather salient comparison to make. But I was also hoping that you could help us understand a little bit more into what these judicial reforms actually are. You kind of explained why they might be being pursued by Netanyahu and his government, but what are the actual changes here?
Yeah, it's important to understand that unlike our system, which has three branches of government with shared and separated powers, the Israeli system essentially combines the executive and legislative into one dimension, which is the current government, right? There's no separation between the legislative branch and the executive branch. Bibi Netanyahu put together a government in which he has a 64-seat majority in 120 Knesset, right? So the legislative, and it's unicameral legislature. It's not, you don't even have two houses. I don't know who said that the Senate was the saucer to cool the tea in reference to the House. That doesn't exist in Israel, which means that the courts, and particularly the Supreme Court, and by the way, Israel doesn't have a written constitution. There's a series of basic laws which are very much tied up and defended by the Supreme Court. So you have a situation where not just Netanyahu, in order to escape his trial, but the other elements of the coalition want to restrict, constrict, undermine the power of the Supreme Court. For Netanyahu, it's his trial. For Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, it's the court's intercession. Not always. In fact, the fact is that very often when it came to housing demolitions and the like, the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of the government. Nonetheless, the court is an obstruction for the religious Zionists and for the ultra-Orthodox, the two parties, Shas and United Torah Judaism, who want more religiosity infused into the state and who want an end to any sort of law that binds their constituents to be conscripted. Undermining the court's power is also in their interests. And if, in fact, the court's power is undermined, and the two pieces that are most sensitive is one, the package of judicial reforms wants all 15 judges of the Israeli Supreme Court to agree before the Supreme Court would override any piece of legislation. And number two, They want an override clause. That is to say, if the Supreme Court rules on issue X, then a narrow majority, 61 seats, could override it. It's called the override clause. There's also another challenge in terms of how judges are selected. Right now, it's a combination. I think it's a 9-member judicial selection committee, which has parliamentarians, judges, and professionals. The reforms want to shift the balance of power, which would give the government the majority in terms of selecting judges. So it's a slam dunk. It's not reform. It's revolution. And in a system like Israel's, and by the way, the Israeli judicial system, this is the third year of Benjamin Netanyahu's trial. It's a very slow-moving system. It needs reform, right? It needs reform. And no Supreme Court is above controversy. Well, I give you ours. So there's no question that reform is needed, but this is not tinkering. This is wholesale abandonment of, I think, the key element in the functioning of Israel's democracy.
Aaron, you're talking about these historic protests over this issue in Israeli domestic politics. I think many observers, including those in the Arab world and elsewhere, are asking the question, protesters, where have you been for 56 years of the occupation? Where have you been for all of the controversies in recent times over the settlements? Where have you been during the wars that we've seen in the last several years in Gaza? It seems as though, even though there are these different factions in Israeli democracy, we've talked about Likud, we've talked about the far right, we've talked about the center-left groups that were in coalition recently, it doesn't seem as though any of these different constituencies really have prioritized the Palestinian issue. Do you think that this is a fair complaint? There was an article in The Guardian today that was describing how Palestinian Israelis, Arabic-speaking Israelis, Christians, and Muslims aren't really participating in these protests, and they feel a sense of apathy.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I do. I mean, what is the major threat to undermining the future of a democratic Jewish state? Judicial reform is huge, but so is the occupation, both demographically and politically. And it dehumanizes as well. The answer to the question, why aren't Israelis voting with their feet and protesting government policy over the Palestinians? There are many, many, many reasons. Number one, when it comes to issue, look, the Palestinian issue is in the minds of most Israelis not looked at as a political issue, right? It's a security issue. And the Israeli public has always deferred to the state when it came to security issues. That's number one. Number two, for demographic and political reasons, there's been a shift to the right. We discussed this over the last 20 or 30 years. Number three, the reality is that if you're living in Tel Aviv and you haven't encountered Palestinians you don't encounter Palestinians. Most Israelis can block out and detach and divorce themselves from what's happening only kilometers away. So you have all these reasons. And then you could argue, and I don't want to get into this argument because it's much more complicated than it appears. Any number of Israeli proposals, I was around a few of them, that have gone unrequited with respect to whether or not the Palestinians would accept them. So you put all this together, and the Palestinian issue, in a way, it's unifying in the sense that it unifies Israelis not to come together in order to demonstrate against the occupation. And yet Israel is a deeply divided country. 30,000 votes separated out of 4 million plus casts separated the results of the last election from the pro-Netanyahu bloc to the anti-Netanyahu bloc. And I think it's a lot easier and a lot more central to the lives of Israelis to look at an issue like judicial reform and the fundamentalists who are controlling the government. And some may argue, look, judicial reform is critical. If we defend our democracy, we may have a chance to open up at some point a pathway toward a settlement. If we don't, and Israel ends up being the Israel of Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, will have no point at all, no chance at all of doing this. I mean, I realize to Palestinians and many in the Arab world and to many in the international community, there's a certain hypocrisy, to say the least, in caring about judicial reform, but not understanding that one of the critical threats facing Israel, its effort to remain a democratic state, is the occupation. So I think and Israeli Arabs, Palestinian citizens of Israel, 20% of the country, I mean, they stand, I understand why they're not participating. And I also, would point out that nor are many Israelis encouraging them to protest. But they stand to be the victims of this judicial reform, because the defense of equality, the basic human civil rights of Israelis, embodied in at least one of the basic laws, if that were overturned, it would open the door to any number of legislative efforts to, you saw the first indication of it in stripping citizenship and residency and deporting Israeli citizens to the West Bank in the event they were convicted of terror operations. So I don't think, and I pointed this out in fact, I have a piece in Foreign Policy coming out in which I argue that in 1851, the United States turned 75. We were 9 years short of a civil war that would fundamentally divide the country and create, I would argue, a second American republic, right, for the better, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. But in 1851, neither the borders of the U.S. nor its identity as a nation were nearly fixed. I am arguing that come May of this year, neither the borders of the state of Israel or the identity of Israel is accepted by millions of humans that reside between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. Now, you could walk away from that and conclude the worst. Or you could walk away and say, there's hope here, because the cast of the nation, both in terms of where it is and what it is yet to be fixed. And I choose to be, even though I'm not hopeful, I will and compel myself to be hopeful, because, as I said, we can't see around corners. And I think it's morally unconscionable, frankly, to say there'll never be a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Well, if you're not hopeful, then what is there?
Well, I'll quote Kennedy here. There's idealism without illusion. I've used this line with you, Justin, before in Clubhouse. That's what Kennedy described himself as, an idealist without illusion. And I belong in that group. If you ask me where we're going to be a year from now, I would say more or less we're going to be where we are now. No one-state solution, no two-state solution, but what I would call, for want of a better word, a three-state solution within a sort of one-state reality. You're going to have Gaza, to which Hamas is attached for many different reasons. You're going to have 40% of the West Bank controlled by the Palestinian Authority, assuming it doesn't collapse, and I don't think it will. Whether Abbas will be around or not, who knows? And you'll have Israel, both the state of Israel proper and the 60% of the West Bank, Area C, which Israel controls. I can't see that sort of future shaken right now. Neither the headlines portend it or the trend lines. Even if you had a major escalation of violence, I don't see how you get from where we are now to something that's fundamentally different than that. Could come, but I can't see it shape. You can quote W.B. Yeats here about his poem, "What beast its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem, to be born, because I still believe we're on the cusp of a very dangerous period.
I suppose there's another Irish poet. Justin will come in with the question, but because you mentioned Yeats, I'm thinking of the line from Heaney about needing to find the opportunity when history and hope rhyme. And maybe that's what we've never had here.
Right. It's one of Biden's favorites, John.
Yeah.
Aaron, you mentioned that we're at a very dangerous point. The political changes and reforms, in your words, border on potentially revolution because of how widespread they are. And earlier in your speech, you mentioned we needed in the area, so Israel and Palestine, we needed leadership, we needed ownership. We don't have those. And then also potentially the United States involvement. Since the Biden administration is not prioritizing this issue for domestic political reasons and realities on the ground, is it maybe the time that the United States hand off this profile to a country, an entity, an organization that maybe is more better equipped to drive towards a hopeful resolution of some of the issues that we're talking about? Or are we just the least bad option of the mediators?
I don't think there's anyone to hand it off to, frankly. The international community has been, by and large, a major disappointment. Look at its response to COVID. Look at its response to climate. Even with respect to Ukraine, you have a divided 2/3 of the world's population live in countries that haven't signed up for sanctions. And frankly, I don't think anyone, in the end, if you got into a serious negotiation, I don't think any other entity has the confidence of the state of Israel as much as the United States does. Now, we'd have to be willing to use that relationship, and special but not exclusive. And at some point, with both parties, use our leverage. Honey and vinegar is what it takes if you're going to get into a negotiation. Ask Kissinger, Carter, Jim Baker. They'll all tell you the same thing. So, no, I don't think the problem is the absolute. First of all, I don't think, not that the United States, for any number of reasons, is the ideal mediator. I just think at this point, there's nobody who could do this, and the international community is fundamentally divided. I mean, think about this. In response to 10 years of Benjamin Netanyahu's leadership, Israel is more well integrated into the world community than at any time since independence. Latin America, Asia, and now with the Abraham Accords. You could argue the ultimate betrayal of the Palestinian cause. You have key Arab states, the Emiratis, one day the Saudis, the Moroccans, Bahrainis, who are prepared to assert their own national interests over the interests of the Palestinians, largely because of a mutual fear of Iran, exhaustion with the Palestinian issue, and they see relations with Israel as a way to get closer to the United States. So for all those reasons, I think it seems to me the international community simply has been unable and unwilling to play a role. And I can't see another mediator. The Russians, the Turks, the French, no, none of them.
Aaron, as you mentioned the Abraham Accords, it brings us to what I think is going to be the last question of our discussion. From my perspective, the Abraham Accords are really mostly about the UAE. Bahrain, a rather small country with not entire degree of independence in its foreign policy. Morocco already had a good relationship with the Israelis, and it's not a Middle Eastern country. And then Sudan, who have not actually gone through a normalization, really leaves the UAE as the leading protagonist of this new phase. And especially in the United States, but also in the Emirates itself, the media have celebrated the decision by the UAE to go ahead with that normalization pretty widely. And it was even talked in some quarters, perhaps erroneously, as being a progressive step for Middle East peace. But I'm wondering, in light of these current events, both in Israeli domestic politics with the judicial reform, but also in particular, the escalation, the likely breakout of further violence in the West Bank, whether this is going to recast the decisions that the UAE have been making recently, whether it will become more clear that their step was not a step forward for the Middle East peace process, and whether it will significantly damage their credibility in the rest of the Arab world.
Yeah, I think the Emiratis will go to great lengths to avoid completely canceling their relationship with the Israelis. They may calibrate them as in response to Israeli negative or positive actions. And the the reality that apparently they pulled their own draft off the table today suggests that they're willing to respond positively if, in fact, there's movement between the Israelis and the Palestinians. So I think the Abraham Accord countries that have now concluded agreements with Israel will probably remain intact. I doubt, frankly, if the circle of those Abraham Accord countries will expand as a consequence of any number of the things that we talked about today.
Well, Aaron, I think that my question has more to do with the backlash that the UAE might face in the rest of the region as a consequence of what Israel are doing now that the UAE have staked their reputation on the Israeli relationship within the Arab world.
It's true. Although look at the last year, the bloodiest since 2005 in terms of Palestinian casualties. And yet the fact is the Emiratis stuck with this. The fact that the Qataris during World Cup allowed charter flights from Israel is another indication. So I think they'll calibrate the relationships rather than try to extinguish them. And I suppose their stock in the region will drop. But, as cradle to grave, womb to tomb societies with very few Palestinian residents, sheltered from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the way the Jordanians and the Egyptians are not, they have a lot more leeway and leverage on this issue than most of their Arab brothers and sisters. So if things blow up, could be a different story. But I think they'll go to some lengths to avoid canceling these relationships.
Well, Aaron, I think that that's going to conclude the conversation we had today, a very important one about issues that matter for people in Israel and in the West Bank, but also in the Middle East and around the world, given the salience of this topic. We're kind of seeing, I suppose, twin or parallel crises unfolding with the judicial reforms, but also this escalation that we seem to be witnessing in the West Bank. So it's certainly a time for the world to once again pay attention to an issue that never seems too far from the top of headlines, but only once in a while really kind of consumes all of our attention.
I enjoyed it, and thanks a lot for having me, Justin and John.